Time to talk to the Minister for Trade and Tourism, Dan Tehan. First, here he was on this program during last year's Victorian lockdown.
This is a failure of leadership by Dan Andrews. Let's be clear about this. And you know where the impact is being felt? On the most vulnerable children, on those children from low socio-economic backgrounds, Indigenous children, rural and remote students, students with a disability. They're the ones being impacted on this.
Well, Dan Tehan, welcome to the program. You were pretty fired up back then, particularly about kids missing school. Here we are back in another lockdown. Kids are again unable to go to school. Is this another failure of leadership?
Well, I think what we've learnt through this pandemic, David, is that what the Australian people want is us focusing on getting the outcomes that we need as we deal with this pandemic and seeing governments work together to make sure that we can get those outcomes. And that really is what's led us to the place we're in at the moment. When you look as how Australia has dealt with this pandemic compared to the rest of the world. Now, obviously the situation in Victoria is a difficult one at the moment, and you know, my thoughts are with everyone in Victoria at the moment as we're dealing with this. But I think if we've learned anything throughout this pandemic, it's that the Australian people want all of us working together, and particularly governments working together with dealing with this.
So that's the lesson you've learned. That's why there's no criticism now of the Victorian government.
Well, I think when you're in a pandemic, when you're facing a crisis like this, we all do have to be working together, and that's what's led to our success in dealing with this pandemic. As the panel was saying earlier, as you were mentioning before, there is no other place that you would rather be at the moment than in Australia when dealing with this crisis. And I think that all of us share that view, and that's because we have more or less been able to work together, and that's what will get us through this current crisis in Victoria at the moment, and hopefully it will only last a week. And
do you think it needs to be
we'll get through it.
Do you think it needs to be a statewide lockdown when there isn't COVID in some of the parts of your electorate?
Well, ultimately, the Victorian state government has had to listen to the medical experts in Victoria and take the decision that they think is best to make this as short a possible lockdown as they possibly can. So they would have listened to that advice and taken that advice. And I must say, when it comes to regional and rural Victorians, the way that they have been prepared to play their part has been incredibly admirable. They've seen it as an important part of making sure that the state comes through this. Now, we've obviously had a lot less impact by the virus in regional and rural Victoria, but they understand if they only lock down Greater Melbourne, it could lead to a lot of people fleeing Melbourne out into regional and rural Victoria, and that could impact on regional and rural communities. So they've been prepared to play their part, and that's very admirable of them.
Just on that and how supportive they are of some of these restrictions, there is a family in Warrnambool, as you know, in your electorate, who were denied an exemption to have more than 10 people at the funeral of their 8-year-old boy who tragically drowned while on a school camp. I know you've spent a long time talking to the mother. Can you understand this decision?
Well, I was dealing with the mother on Thursday, and this is the most tragic of circumstances. And can I say, I spoke to her again yesterday, and there were two things that she really wanted passed on. First of all, she's hoping that the lockdown will end, that what we're dealing with at the moment in Victoria will end, and over time she'll be able to have the funeral that she wants for her son, where the community, his friends can come together and they can celebrate the life that he lived. And also, can I say, she is an extraordinary person, the compassion and the courage that she's shown dealing with the tragic circumstances that have confronted her. My heart, my thoughts, my prayers are with her and her family, but I've got to say the way that she has dealt with these circumstances is a lesson for all of us in Australia. The grace that she's shown and the decency that she has shown has been quite extraordinary.
Look, this lockdown's going to hurt a lot of casual workers, including in your seat right across Victoria. What support is the federal government going to give?
Well, we already have existing support available for Victorians. There's a disaster pandemic leave payment that's available.
Hang on, that pandemic payment is available if you've got COVID or you're a close contact, right? It's not available to all casual workers who are hit by this lockdown.
And there's also an emergency health payment that is available as well.
Not to all casual workers, though. I'm asking about, if you work at a restaurant, a cafe, a bar, a gym and so on, you don't have work for a week, you don't have an income, what do they get?
Well, you can go to Centrelink, and if you're eligible, if you've lost a complete week's work, or if you're going to leave 2 weeks' work, then you might be eligible for one of these emergency health payments. So for those people who find themselves in circumstances where they've completely lost their income, then they should go to Centrelink and see where they're eligible for.
Well, I had a look at the Government Services Australia
remember,
website, and that wasn't my reading of it. Are you saying to us this morning that if you don't necessarily have COVID, you're not necessarily close contact, but if you are nonetheless affected by the lockdown, you can access one of these payments?
If you've lost your income, and obviously it depends on eligibility, and you're going to lose your income for the week, then you should go to Centrelink and see whether you might be eligible for an emergency payment.
Are you eligible if you don't have COVID? Are you announcing a new government policy position here that you can get the payment?
This is not a new government policy.
So you can't get the payment if you don't have COVID, or you're not a close contact?
Well, what I'm saying is, you should, if you've lost all your income, and then you should go to Centrelink and see whether you're eligible for payments.
And what will they say? What will they say if you don't have COVID or you're not a close contact?
I mean, David, it will depend on your circumstances and on your loss of income. So they will assess your situation and see whether you're eligible for a payment. And what you have to remember, David, in terms of federal government support for Victoria during this pandemic, we have paid more federal government support for Victoria per capita than any state or territory. It's $46 billion. And if you accumulate what we've paid in support to every other state and territory, the support we've paid to Victoria is double that. And
well, just on that, I mean, we keep hearing the government boast about the importance of JobKeeper, you know, during last year. If it was so important then, why isn't there something similar now?
Well, this is a 7-day short lockdown, which we hope will be effective and will finish. And obviously what we've seen with the case numbers, 4 and then 5 in the last 2 days, all of us are hoping that this will be a short 7-day lockdown. Our budget also has provided support. It was handed down 2 weeks ago, ongoing support for Victorians. And the Victorian State Government have said that they're going to announce some funding for business today.
I'm just asking about the workers,
wait and see.
It still sounds like there's nothing for the workers.
Well, let's wait and see what that funding provides.
Right.
And obviously we'll continue to have discussions with the Victorian State Government, and we'll continue to monitor the situation.
So the government might still do something?
Well, obviously we are providing support and ongoing support to Victorians.
Just not for the workers.
Provided record levels of numbers of support to Victoria, and we'll continue to stand by Victorians.
Now, most states have shut their borders to anyone coming from either Melbourne or Victoria. You're the Minister for Tourism. What impact will this have on domestic tourism?
Well, in Victoria, obviously, that will have a significant impact on domestic tourism.
And other states?
From the rest of the country, the feedback that I'm getting at the moment, in particular from the airlines, is that we're seeing pretty much business as usual with regards to domestic tourism. So obviously an impact in and out of Victoria, but between other states, what we're seeing is that it's pretty much business as usual.
Right. So no criticism of the states shutting their borders this time?
Well, obviously we want to minimise states closing their borders as much as they possibly can. But as we've said all along, if health authorities deem that that's what's necessary, then it's the thing that has got us through handling this virus, listening to that health advice. And so we'll continue to work with states and territories to support the tourism industry, especially the domestic tourism industry at this time. Right. And the quicker that we can open those borders, the better, obviously, for our economy as a whole, but for the domestic tourism industry as well.
What's the plan for reopening the international border?
Well, obviously this is something that we're continuing to assess and continuing to monitor. The budget had an assumption that it would occur at the middle of next year. But as the virus continues, and you've got to remember, internationally, more cases and more deaths now than we've had through the whole period of this virus.
Sure,
so
but is there any plan, any sort of roadmap? That other countries have, at least given their tourism industry some sort of roadmap. Have you got one?
Well, we're continually looking and assessing what that roadmap would look like. Obviously, the bubble with New Zealand has been an important component and important first step of opening the border up. But
so are you working on a roadmap?
Well, we're continuing to work on a roadmap, but we've got to continue to assess what's occurring. Well, obviously it depends on circumstance. For instance, one of the things earlier in the year that we're looking at and obviously had some very preliminary discussions with the Singaporean government on was if we could get a bubble operating with New Zealand, then potentially could we look at one with Singapore. Now, obviously, they've been impacted by the virus recently. So so these things obviously have to always be under review. We have to be looking at and very dependent on A, what the expert medical advice is, and B, what the circumstances are with the virus, which is still ravaging countries overseas.
Sure. It brings us to vaccines. Pretty important. Do you think we are in a race to get vaccinated or not?
Well, the Melbourne Cup's a race, the Stall Gifts a race. When it comes to vaccines, what we're trying to do is to make sure that we can get as many people vaccinated as quickly as we possibly can. And if you look at the first 1 million doses that were administered in this country, it took 47 days for those doses to be administered. The last 1 million was done in 13 days. So you're seeing a rapid ramp up, and we'll continue to try and get as many people vaccinated as we possibly can.
So it's not a race, or it is a race?
Well, you don't describe a vaccine rollout as a race. The Melbourne Cup's a race, the Stall Gifts a race. What we're trying to do is get as many people vaccinated as we possibly can, as quickly as we possibly can. 47 days for the first 1 million, 13 days for the last 1 million, and we're going to continue to try and ramp that up as quickly as we possibly can.
A couple on your trade portfolio, if we can. Australia's already taking action in the World Trade Organisation against China over barley tariffs. Are you going to lodge a second case to support Australian wine makers?
Well, that's something we've got under active consideration. We've had detailed discussions with the wine industry on this, and from the outset we've always said that we would take a very principled approach to dealing with these trade disputes, and if we think our industry's been harmed or injured, we'll take all necessary steps and measures to try and address that. And obviously a very important step is to go to the World Trade Organisation and to deal with this as a dispute there, and that's something we've got under active consideration.
Would you be worried, as part of your consideration, how China might respond to any sort of retaliation from Beijing?
Well, China and all other countries use the dispute settlement mechanism at the World Trade Organisation. This is a normal course of dealing with these disputes. So what we want to do is make sure that we have a very strong legal case to be able to take to the World Trade Organisation, because obviously if you take a case, you want to do your best to try and win it. So we've been getting all the information that we need to make sure that we've got a very strong case to take. We've pretty much finished getting all that information, and now we're about to make the final decision as to whether we should go to the WTO.
And finally, the UK Free Trade Agreement. I know the Prime Minister's going to be visiting Boris Johnson in a couple of weeks when he goes over for the G7. Have you finished the negotiations on this? Is it simply now waiting for the two PMs to announce it, or are you still negotiating?
No, we're still negotiating.
Over what? What's the sticking point?
Oh, well, there's a lot of fine detail that has to be worked through when it comes to these agreements, and I was in lengthy discussions with Liz Truss on Friday night. I'll be speaking to her again on Tuesday, and we'll be speaking, I'm sure, regularly this coming week. These are very complex, detailed
what are you
negotiations.
stuck on? There's pushback in the UK over letting more Australian beef and lamb into the country. Is that the issue?
Well, that's an issue that we continue to discuss. There's issues we continue to discuss around mobility, how we can get more ability for Brits and Australians to move between two countries, what we can do additionally when it comes to investment, what we can do additionally when it comes to services, and ultimately in the end an agreement that will be a win-win for both nations. And so those discussions continue. I think it's 15 days till our PM is over in the UK, so it's going to be a very busy week or 10 days for me coming up.
We'll let you get back to it. Dan Tehan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.